Hey everyone, welcome back. You ready to jump into some post-election analysis? I
Always.
think this is going to be a fun one. Today we are looking at the idea that Obamaism is over. You
Ooh.
got this pretty fiery piece by Josh Hammer. You might know him from Newsweek or his appearances on Sky News Australia,
Right.
and he's making some pretty bold claims.
Yeah.
For instance, he says that Trump swept all the swing states,
Wow.
and he doesn't hold back when he's describing this supposed collapse of the Obama coalition.
Hmm. It's interesting how Hammer uses this term Obamaism, almost like it's its own distinct political era.
Yeah.
He argues that the diverse voter base that Obama brought together, Black, Hispanic, immigrant, and youth voters, has totally disintegrated, which led to this decisive Trump victory.
And he uses some strong language to describe it too, like utter ruination and decay.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that? Is it really the end for this voting bloc, or is this just like a temporary setback?
It's definitely dramatic language for sure. I think he might be tapping into this sense of disillusionment among some who felt represented by that coalition.
Right.
But to say it's completely dead, that might be a little premature. If you think back to the historical context, the Obama coalition was already unique because it built upon but also differed from previous Democratic coalitions.
Okay.
It mobilized groups that hadn't consistently voted Democrat before.
Hmm.
So rather than saying it's completely collapsed, what we might be seeing is like a reshuffling of the political deck.
Okay. So maybe not a total demise, but definitely a shift.
Mm.
What factors beyond just Trump's appeal could be contributing to this change? And what does this all mean for Obama's legacy,
Mm.
especially since he was out there actively campaigning for the Democratic ticket?
That's a really good question. Hammer argues that Obama actually put his legacy on the line by doing that.
Oh, wow.
He even goes as far as to suggest that Obama should step back from public life entirely after this loss.
Wow.
Pretty harsh, right? It definitely makes you think, though, how will this election impact how history views Obama's presidency?
Yeah, it's definitely a turning point, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And speaking of turning points, Hammer makes this bold prediction. He says that J.D. Vance is likely to be the next president in 2028. Now, some of you might be thinking, who's J.D. Vance?
Right.
Well, he's the author of Hillbilly Elegy, which got a lot of attention for its look at the white working class in America.
Right.
And he's become a really prominent voice in conservative politics, aligning himself with Trump's populist message.
Mm.
So Hammer sees this potential Vance victory as a continuation of Trump's influence on the GOP and American politics in general.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Hammer seems almost resigned to the idea that the Democrats will keep repeating the same strategies, even though he sees them as failed.
Mm.
It makes you wonder, can political parties really adapt and evolve, or are they just stuck in their ways?
That's a really good question. I mean, history does show us that parties can change, but it's often a slow and messy process. But let's move on to something that's been driving a lot of discussion. The pollster's Hammer really takes them to task for missing the mark, especially in those key swing states.
Yeah.
He highlights how even that gold standard Iowa pollster was way off base. Why do they keep getting it wrong?
It's definitely been a growing disconnect between polls and election results. One thing is that it could be that pollsters are having a harder time reaching representative samples of the population in today's world.
Right.
People are busier, more distrustful of institutions, and just harder to reach in general.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, the rise of cell phones has made traditional phone polling less reliable.
It's like trying to bake a cake with half the ingredients missing.
Exactly.
You might get something resembling a cake, but it's not going to be what you expect.
Exactly. And another factor could be this social desirability bias.
Yep.
People might not want to admit to their true voting intentions, especially if they think their views are unpopular.
So it's not just who the pollsters are reaching, but also whether those people are being completely honest.
Right.
And then you have the whole issue of social media and the echo chambers it creates.
No, absolutely. People are constantly being bombarded with information that just confirms their existing biases and that can really distort their perception of reality. It makes it even harder for pollsters to accurately gauge public opinion.
So what do we do? How do we make sense of all of this? Especially when it comes to understanding what people are truly thinking and how they'll vote.
It might require going beyond those traditional polling methods and looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
We need to consider the social and economic forces that are shaping people's beliefs and their voting behavior.
Now let's shift gears and talk about what Hammer sees on the horizon for Trump's second term, especially when it comes to his foreign policy agenda.
Okay.
So Hammer predicts that Trump is going to focus on three key areas: ending the Russia-Ukraine war, quickly empowering Netanyahu in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and taking a hard line on Iran. He specifically anticipates a swift resolution to the conflict in Ukraine, potentially within the first 100 to 200 days, leveraging Trump's negotiation skills.
Hmm.
And he thinks that Trump is going to encourage Netanyahu to take some decisive action in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, aiming for a pretty quick resolution there as well.
Okay.
And then with Iran, he expects a return to that maximum pressure campaign, including reinstating sanctions on oil exports.
Wow, those are some bold predictions.
They are, but are they realistic? What potential obstacles or unintended consequences could arise? And what does all of this mean for the global balance of power? We'll tackle those questions and more after a quick break. Okay, so we're back and ready to dig a little deeper into those predictions for Trump's second term. Now, he makes it sound like it's all a sure thing,
Right.
but I'm kind of curious, how much of this is based on like a realistic view of foreign policy and how much of it is, I don't know, wishful thinking?
Yeah, it's important to remember that foreign policy is really this like complex web of relationships and alliances
Right.
and, a lot of unpredictable events. Yeah.
So while Trump might have this very specific vision in mind, the reality on the ground can be very different.
Totally. It's not like he can just snap his fingers and get everybody to do what he wants.
Right.
So let's take the Russia-Ukraine war, for example. Even if Trump is like this skilled negotiator, can he really achieve like a lasting peace within his first 100 days, like Hammer suggests?
Well, a lasting peace really requires addressing all those underlying issues that led to the conflict in the first place.
Yeah.
It's not just about like brokering a deal. It's about understanding the grievances on both sides and finding a way forward that everyone can live with. That takes time and diplomacy and a whole lot of patience.
And what about the Israel-Palestine conflict? I mean, that's been a powder keg for decades with
Yeah.
like all these different attempts at resolution coming and going. Is it even realistic to think that Trump can just like swoop in and fix it, like Hammer puts it?
The Israel-Palestine conflict is just incredibly complex. It has these historical, religious, and political dimensions that are also intertwined.
So it's not a matter of just like imposing some solution from the outside.
Right.
Any lasting resolution is going to require both sides to make some really difficult compromises and acknowledge each other's concerns.
So it sounds like Hammer might be oversimplifying things a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Iran. Hammer seems pretty confident that Trump will just go back to his hardline approach with the sanctions and maybe even more. But wouldn't that just like totally escalate tensions in the region?
Yeah, reinstating sanctions and taking that kind of confrontational stance, it could really backfire. It might just push Iran even further away from the negotiating table.
Right.
And it could even lead to them like restarting their nuclear program.
Oh, wow.
And then there's the risk of destabilizing the whole region, which could have consequences that we can't even predict.
Yeah. So while Hammer's predictions are definitely interesting, it's probably best to take them with a grain of salt. Foreign policy is rarely straightforward, and there are always those unintended consequences to think about. But I want to shift gears for a second and go back to that idea of the shattered Obama coalition.
Okay.
Do you really think it's fair to characterize it as this like monolithic entity that's completely fallen apart?
I think it's more nuanced than that. Remember, the Obama coalition was always this diverse group of people with a bunch of different reasons for supporting him. To say that they were all like united by one ideology or set of beliefs, I think that's a little too simple.
It's like that saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism.
Right.
You can't make generalizations about entire groups of people.
Exactly. So instead of looking at this election as the definitive end of the Obama coalition, it might be better to see it as like a reflection of how the political landscape is changing and, the different needs and aspirations of all these different voters.
Okay, I get that. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to those pollsters.
Yeah.
Why do you think they keep missing the mark? Is it just like bad methodology, or is there something more going on?
Well, like we were saying earlier, reaching a really representative sample of the population, it's getting harder and harder.
Yeah.
But beyond that, there's also the issue of how people respond to polls. In this really polarized political environment, people might not feel comfortable sharing their honest opinions. They're afraid of being judged or criticized.
It's like they're playing poker, keeping their cards close to the vest.
Right. And then you have the influence of social media. People are constantly being hit with all this information. Some of it's true, some of it's not. And that creates these echo chambers where people only hear things that reinforce what they already believe. So it makes it really difficult to get a good read on what the public is actually thinking.
So it's not just about the polls themselves, it's about the whole information ecosystem around them.
Exactly. We have to be aware of those limitations and realize that polls are just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Okay, well said.
Yeah.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from those shattered coalitions to polling pitfalls to those really bold predictions about the future.
We have.
But I think there's still more to unpack. So let's continue this conversation after a short break. Okay, so we're back. And you know what I've been thinking?
What's that?
We've talked a lot about these like pundits and pollsters and predictions, but what about the average person? Like the listener.
That's a great point. We can get so caught up in these big picture analyses,
Right.
but at the end of the day, it's individual voters who are shaping the future of the country.
Exactly. So as we try to understand these ideas, like the end of Obamaism or the rise of J.D. Vance,
Hmm.
what does it all mean for you? The person listening right now.
Where do you see yourself in this whole evolving political story? Do these things resonate with you, or do you have a completely different perspective?
It's like we're all navigating this giant choose-your-own-adventure book,
Right.
except these choices have real-world consequences.
Exactly. And those choices are made through your vote, your voice, your engagement in the whole political process. So don't just sit back and accept somebody else's interpretation. Think critically, analyze the information, and come to your own conclusions.
Because even if you feel disillusioned or frustrated right now,
Yeah.
remember that these political systems, they're not static. They're always changing.
Yeah, new leaders emerge, new ideas take root, and the pendulum of power, it always swings back and forth.
That's a good point. So
Mhm.
instead of focusing on the end of something, maybe it's better to think about what might come next.
Right, what could emerge in its place?
Exactly. So if this election really does mark a shift in American politics, what could that shift actually look like? What new alliances might form? What issues might take center stage?
And how can we make sure that those diverse voices are heard and represented in this new landscape? Those are all questions that we need to be asking.
Yeah.
They require open dialogue and, thoughtful debate and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Because ultimately, the future of American democracy, it depends on active and informed citizens. Yeah.
People who are willing to engage and wrestle with complex issues and make their voices heard.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. That's how we collectively shape the future.
So on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. We've covered a lot,
We have.
from those shattered coalitions to polling problems to those pretty bold predictions about what's to come.
It's been a journey.
But this is just the beginning. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, do your own research, find different perspectives, and, have those thoughtful discussions with others.
Yeah. Stay engaged.
Because this political landscape, it's always changing. So stay curious, stay informed, and until next time, happy diving.